After being with Jacob Scott for 3 years, I discovered that he had always had a goddess in his heart who had passed away 10 years ago. I didn't cry or throw a fit, I simply said, "It's okay. Everyone has someone they can't let go of." A few days later, he brought home a girl who resembled the goddess in his heart even more. "Jacob, I just miss her so much. You said it was okay, right?" I nodded in response. That night, I made a call and told him that I missed him and wanted him to come back. Today marks the 3rd anniversary of Jacob Scott and me. I had just gotten home from work when I was greeted by a strong smell of alcohol, and I couldn't help but cough a few times. I absolutely dislike the smell of alcohol, which is why over the past 3 years, Jacob Scott has rarely drunk it, only occasionally having a little. He was passed out on the sofa, with nearly 10 empty bottles scattered around him. "Forget it," I sighed. "After all, we didn't celebrate our anniversary in the first 2 years either." I walked over, picked up the empty bottles scattered on the floor, loosened his tie, changed his clothes, and then carefully helped him back to his room. It's better to wait until he wakes up to ask him about everything. Hearing Jacob Scott's steady snoring made me feel a lot calmer inside. After I took a shower and sat down on the edge of the bed, Jacob Scott's brother called him. I was worried that I might wake Jacob Scott, but I was also afraid there might be something urgent, so I went to the living room to answer the call. As soon as I connected, the other person kept talking without letting me interject. I felt a bit confused, but there were a few sentences that I clearly understood. The person mentioned Jacob, saying that today we couldn't help but talk, thinking that you had long since stopped caring, that Lily had been gone for 10 years and it was time to let go. I was taken aback for a moment and it took me a while to ask, "Who is Lily?" Realizing that something was wrong, the person on the other end of the phone hurriedly explained, "Sister-in-law, please don't misunderstand, I was just speaking casually." After saying that, they hung up. I was unwilling to back down and called several more times, continuing to ask, "Who is Lily?" This time, the other party finally agreed to talk. To my surprise, as I patiently listened, I ended up spending an hour hearing about my boyfriend's love story with his first love. I started to doubt whether I had a tendency for self-abuse. When we reached the end of the conversation, Jacob Scott's brother seemed to have forgotten I was still on the line. He sighed and said that if Lily hadn't been ill and was still around, Jacob wouldn't have to force himself to move on with someone else. I hung up the phone and suddenly laughed. I recalled how every time he returned from a business trip, he would hold me tight, kissing me and saying, "Amy, I truly love you." However, he always pronounces the word with the first tone. I constantly criticize him and ask when he will be able to change his accent. Each time, he acts cute and begs for my forgiveness. He looks like a puppy, and his adorable demeanor when he's being charming always melts my heart. So, I can't help but forgive him every time. Until now, I finally understand that the man who claimed to love me for 3 years actually saw me as nothing more than a substitute. I slept in the guest room. When I woke up the next day, Jacob Scott was lying next to me, staring at me intently. I was startled awake and instantly alert. He pulled me into his arms. "Did I make you unhappy last night because I drank too much?" "I was wrong, dear." The smell of alcohol still lingered around Jacob Scott, and I frowned, trying to break free. He seemed a bit impatient, as if to say, "I've already made an effort to reconcile, what more do you want?" I thought to myself that his friends must have already told him about last night's events. "Who do you think I am?" I said lightly. "Am I just your deceased white moonlight?" Jacob Scott's breathing grew heavier, and tears shimmered in his eyes. He replied, "Your eyes are like hers, but compared to her, you're still far from it." I smiled. Living people can never argue with the dead. I understand this principle well. His tears flowed more and more, and I gently wiped them away with a tissue. Then, I patted his shoulder and smiled to comfort him, saying, "It's okay, everyone has someone unforgettable in their heart." A glimmer of surprise flashed in Jacob Scott's eyes. I just knew that Jacob understood me best. On that day, he confided in me about his feelings. Lily suddenly passed away from cancer, and I hadn't even finished the love letter I was writing to her. Although no one believed that she liked me, I knew that every glance she gave me expressed her desire to be with me. "Do you know that? Lily is really a great person. She is pure and kind-hearted." He told me how much he misses her and regrets not confessing his feelings for her earlier. Every time he mentioned something, I offered him comfort. He also took a photo out of his wallet to show me. In the picture, the girl is wearing a beautiful white dress, standing among the flowers and smiling sweetly. She looks very optimistic. I said that it was great, but unfortunately, I couldn't see what she looked like, which was really a shame. However, just a few days later, he brought a girl home. This girl looked innocent and cute, with a great deal of naivety. Jacob Scott introduced her to me, saying, "Jacob, weren't you wanting to see what Lily looked like a couple of days ago? Sophie is really similar to her, so I brought her here to meet you." The girl bowed her head and shyly said, "Hello, sister." I raised my eyebrows, finding it somewhat amusing. So, he actually thought that after I comforted him for a few moments, I would be so generous as to accept his infidelity? Besides, if he truly loved Lily, he shouldn't always be looking for someone to substitute for her. She will always be herself, and no one can replace her. Seeing that I was a bit angry, Jacob Scott, "Jacob, I just miss her too much. You said it was okay, right?" I couldn't help but laugh, suddenly feeling like I didn't want to be with him anymore. The moment he said that, I nodded in agreement. A few minutes later, he happily went out with that girl, saying he wanted to treat her to dinner as a thank you for coming. By midnight, however, he hadn't even finished his meal. I flipped through my contacts and removed that number from the blacklist before dialing it. It rang once before being answered. A cold voice came from the other end. He finally decided to take my call. I said, "I miss you, come back." There's also a special person in my heart, just like Jacob Scott. The difference is that my person is still alive. 3 years ago, David Williams and I had a quarrel and eventually broke up. At that time, neither of us was mature enough. We didn't know how to communicate effectively when problems arose and instead blamed each other. Even though there was love in our hearts, we always hurt each other with the most painful words. We agreed to take a break for a while. He said that during this time, I could try dating other guys. If I found someone more suitable, he would choose to let go. I stayed at home for a long time without reaching out to anyone else. One day, I went to my parents' cemetery to visit them and talk to them. The more I spoke, the more I felt aggrieved, and eventually I ended up crying very hard. At that moment, someone handed me a tissue, and when I looked up, I saw a person completely different from David Williams. His eyes were also red as he squatted down to comfort me. Then, he asked for my WeChat. After that, he began to pursue me. At first, he treated me very well, like a little son, but gradually, he became distant. His personality was completely different from when he was chasing me. He became lazy and childish, and he also started to lose his temper. The more things were like this, the more I missed David Williams. The first thought that perhaps every man was like this, and I couldn't let him down. Surprisingly, I held on this way for 3 years. While I was packing my bags, the doorbell rang. I thought it was Jacob Scott returning, so I went to open the door. David Williams's face came into view, his smile bold and unconventional. "Chinee, I've told you before, I'm the one who's best suited for you." My suitcase was right behind me, and he seemed impatient, quickly moving around to drag it out and pulling me along with it. Then, with a wave of his hand, the door closed behind us. "Come home with me." At 3 in the morning, there were hardly any cars on the road, and David Williams quietly increased his speed. Within less than an hour, we arrived at his house. As soon as we stepped inside, before I could say anything, he eagerly kissed me. David Williams was half a head taller than Jacob Scott, and it felt a bit strange to me since I hadn't seen him in such a long time. He held the back of my neck and lifted me onto the table, kissing me with a combination of strength and tenderness. 3 years later, we met again. His kiss carried an indescribable emotion, as if expressing the bitterness of those 3 years. He called my name softly, causing my heart to flutter. By the end, my legs felt weak, and I could only lean on him, gasping for breath. He gently stroked my hair, and it seemed he was tired as well. I hadn't exerted much effort, yet he appeared this way. I gave his chest a light tap and asked him, "Aren't you in the North City? Why are you back so soon?" "I came back 2 years ago." "Didn't I tell you with my alternate account?" "Oh, I forgot." He gently bit my shoulder in a playful, somewhat punishing tone and added, "Then think about it carefully." I was awakened by the sound of my phone ringing. The light was a bit too bright, and it took me a while to adjust after sitting up. Last night I was extremely exhausted. I glanced at the instigator, who was now deep in sleep. Without thinking much, I answered the phone. Since I had just woken up, my voice was a bit hoarse. I said, "Hello? Jacob, where have you been? Where are your things?" The voice on the other end sounded a bit anxious. I swallowed hard and replied softly, "I took them away." He then asked, "Where did you take them? Are you on a business trip? Why didn't you tell me? Don't you care about me anymore?" I said I'm on vacation and not on a business trip. We broke up. Jacob Scott seemed unable to believe it. After a moment of silence, just as I was about to hang up, he hurriedly asked if it was because of Sophie. I've already explained that I just took her out to dinner, nothing more. There's no need for you to be so calculative about it. Besides, I was only fulfilling your wish to see Lily. Are you still thinking about Lily? Let me tell you, if it's because of her, I think you shouldn't behave like this. The deceased deserve respect. Let me say again, I'm giving you just one chance. David Williams didn't know when he had woken up. He reached out and hung up the phone. It's impressive that you can still take in all of this. I kept my eyes closed, feeling very sleepy, and honestly didn't catch much of what was said. That guy is really disappointing. He can't compare to my dedication at all. Why are you even with him? I can hardly imagine how you have spent these 3 years. I covered his mouth to stop him from talking, then got up to wash up. He was really too noisy. As a result, he seemed to wake up suddenly, jumping out of bed and following me everywhere I went. I couldn't help but feel both amused and helpless. I could only stroke his head, hold him close, rest my forehead on his chest, and gently comfort him. "It's okay. I'm sorry. I won't leave you again. I know you're always the best to me." David Williams cupped my face, looking at me from side to side, tears streaming down his cheeks. "What kind of hardships have you been through these past 3 years?" He had never once said he was sorry while we were together. I paused for a moment before realizing this. Sure, that's right, I had almost forgotten. When I was with David Williams, I was always so proud, never apologizing and never doing any housework. David Williams never let me worry about these things. One time, he got off work very late, and I was waiting for him in the living room. As I waited, I suddenly thought he might be hungry, so I decided to cook him a bowl of noodles. I took eggs and tomatoes out of the fridge, preparing to make a late-night snack. As a result, I accidentally cut my finger while slicing tomatoes. When I brought the noodles to the dining table, he had just come back. The first thing he noticed was my finger, which was covered with a band-aid. "How did you get hurt?" he asked. I said, "It's okay, it doesn't hurt. I'm worried you might be hungry, so I want to make you a late-night snack." She frowned, tore open the band-aid, and said, "This isn't the right way to put it on. You need to disinfect it with iodine first." Actually, I wanted to say that the wound isn't deep and it will heal in a while. After taking care of the wound, he finally started eating the noodles. He said, "The noodles I cooked are the best in the world," and before long, he finished them. But when I took a bite, I found it a bit salty. To me, he felt as if he was cradled in my hands. He said all I needed to do was to be a little princess and not worry about anything else. Jacob Scott is somewhat immature, his home is never tidy, and he doesn't cook, so I had to grow up in order to handle life. David Williams didn't say anything, but he looked at me with a heartache. I wanted to say something, but my nose tingled, and I suddenly felt a surge of injustice. Even though I knew I owed an apology to David Williams, I couldn't stop myself from crying. Perhaps it was due to my emotions, or maybe I had come to a realization about myself. Many scenes influenced by Jacob Scott flashed through my mind. At the time, I thought they were nothing, but looking back now, they feel truly frightening and make me feel wronged. I held David Williams tightly and said, "David, I won't leave you ever again." He gently stroked the back of my head as tears fell onto my hair, saying, "I'm sorry, it's my fault. If I had brought you back sooner, you wouldn't have had to suffer so much." On the 7th day at David Williams' house, my vacation came to an end, and I had to go back to work. I asked David Williams to leave first and took a more low-key car because I still didn't want too many people to know about our relationship. To my surprise, as soon as I arrived downstairs at the office, I was intercepted by Jacob Scott. He asked, "Is this your car? Can you afford it? Which wealthy person are you involved with?" I told him to leave me alone. However, he kept pestering me, asking why I just walked away without saying a word. "Did you ever ask for my thoughts?" I smiled and wondered why you would need to ask for my opinion. "I'm your boyfriend, after all. you should probably listen to me more, since I'm a guy. I chuckled softly, feeling a bit helpless. After being with Jacob Scott for 3 years, I had never noticed his blatant male chauvinism before. Breaking up has always been my decision alone, and I don't need to seek your approval, I said. He seemed to think of something, his lips curling up slightly as he let out a low chuckle. His smile was a bit gentle, which made me feel somewhat uneasy. I suddenly realized that he might be a little jealous. Don't worry, I've never really liked Sophie, she just resembles Lily a bit, so I glanced at her a few more times. I felt a bit helpless as I stared at the bed for a while. Last night, Sophie posted a provocative photo along with a message. Sister, men always prefer the young, even if it's just a substitute. I won't give him back to you. I never expected that someone who appeared so obedient on the surface would be doing such things behind my back. However, she surely didn't anticipate that the repercussions would come so quickly. After all, Jacob Scott had once said that she resembled his moonlight. Once Jacob Scott ended the relationship, he completely ignored her. Because he considered that a girl in her early 20s would inevitably need money to sustain her life. Meanwhile, I could earn money independently. Jacob Scott paused for a moment and continued, Jacob, don't worry, I'll get through this. Lily is gone, but I will look ahead and strive to live well with you. After speaking, he reached out to touch my head. Before I could dodge away, his wrist was grabbed by someone and he was thrown off. Jacob Scott stumbled back a couple of steps and fell to the ground, looking visibly angry, with the corners of his mouth slightly twisted as he muttered something under his breath. Upon seeing the other person, I felt a bit intimidated and hurriedly smiled as I asked, Mr. Williams, what are you doing here? David Williams was dressed in a sharp suit, looking particularly energetic. It was the first time I had seen him so formally dressed, and he stood very composed. He stood in front of me, his athletic build completely blocking my view. I couldn't help but poke him in the back. He grabbed my fingers and said, don't mess around. Oh, I mumbled a slight complaint. He released my hand again and said, well, go ahead and mess around then. I smiled and grabbed the hem of his shirt. Seeing this scene, Jacob Scott furrowed his brows and waved at me unhappily, urging me to come over quickly. He reminded me that this was Mr. Williams, someone I shouldn't provoke. I stood still, tightly clutching David Williams' shirt. Jacob Scott tried to come over to bring me to his side, but he was somewhat hindered by David Williams. He could only bend slightly and, with a smile, said, Mr. Williams, could you please step aside? She doesn't understand and keeps trying to get close to wealthy people. I'll make sure to teach her a lesson. David Williams asked coldly, who is she to you? How do you plan to handle this? She's my girlfriend, and I will make her apologize to you. When we get home, I'm not letting her have dinner. I could feel David Williams's anger, and before I could stop him, his fist had already swung out. Have you been treating her this way for the past 3 years? Actually, it's not that serious. After all, I can cook for myself and order takeout. Jacob Scott doesn't affect me. Jacob Scott covered his face and said, Mr. Williams, what do you mean by that? Did she say something to you? You shouldn't believe her. She's quite skilled at attracting people. I know she is my girlfriend. David Williams held me in his arms. She has always been my girlfriend. I wanted her to experience the diversity of the outside world. Do you have any opinions on that? Jacob Scott was taken aback, and after a while, he managed to stammer out that he had no objections. After work, David Williams waited for me downstairs at my office, dressed neatly and with a cold expression, standing there as the center of attention in the crowd. The female employees in the company all looked up at him. A colleague who I have a good relationship with pulled me aside and asked, is that the new boss from the company next door? He seems to be staring at you. Is he interested? I whispered back to her, that's my boyfriend. She put her hand over her mouth, clearly surprised and excited, and said, we need to chat more about this tomorrow. With that, she walked away. David Williams walked over and shook my hand. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed Jacob Scott standing not far away, looking at me but hesitating to approach. I redirected my attention and ignored him. When the traffic was stalled, I asked David Williams, when did you get promoted to such a high position? At the time of our breakup, he was just a junior employee in the company, and I couldn't believe that in just 3 short years, he had become the general manager. Do you think I have wasted these 3 years? I hope that when you come back, you'll see a successful person, not just an ordinary employee who has spent 3 years in mediocrity. That's why I work even harder, developing my strengths in Beijing, and I'll consider coming back only when I have the option. I suddenly felt some pity for him and said, "What if I don't come back?" He replied, "Then I'll work hard to bring you back." He took a notebook out of the glove compartment, saying that he had already thought through his plans. I opened the notebook to find it filled with dense text, covering all the possible reasons I might refuse him and the ways he would try to win me back. He said, "When you called me that day, I honestly wondered if I was dreaming. I thought you had already forgotten about me." I smiled, but tears welled up in my eyes. How could anyone possibly forget their first love? You arrived so suddenly that day, I even felt like I was dreaming. I thought to myself, someone as proud as Chini would not call me to reconcile unless they had gone through a lot. The car in front of us had already driven away, and David Williams pressed the gas pedal, keeping up with the flow of traffic. I turned my head and looked at his face reflected in the car window. The bone structure is great, and the profile looks good too, but he has matured quite a bit compared to 3 years ago. I asked him if it was worth doing all this for me, and he said, "As long as it's you, it's worth it." After returning home, David Williams took a shower first. I sat on the sofa playing on my phone and received a lot of text messages from Jacob Scott's alternate account. "How did you meet Mr. Williams? You don't need to lower yourself like this to get back at me. When are you coming back? No one is taking out the trash at home, and the floors aren't being cleaned. It feels like the whole house is a mess when you're not here. Where did you put the medicine cabinet? I have a headache. When can you come back to keep me company? I know you want to make me jealous, but I've already told you before that David Williams is deliberately targeting me. He is not a good person at all." I remember Jacob Scott did mention his new general manager to me. He said that the new Mr. Williams always deliberately puts him in embarrassing situations and often picks on him, even making him go buy coffee. He doesn't hold a high position and doesn't dare to resist. Therefore, he attributed all of this to Mr. Williams feeling jealous of his appearance. Jacob Scott was good-looking, but David Williams had even more captivating features, truly a perfect 360-degree appeal. With his tall stature and model-like proportions, it was evident at first glance who looked better when the two stood side by side. I couldn't help but laugh at his self-deception. Just then, David Williams came out of the bathroom. He smiled slightly, sat down next to me, and asked what I was watching that made me so happy. I replied that it was nothing. He glanced at my phone screen and softly remarked that he really took himself seriously. His hair was dripping wet, and the water trickled down onto his toned abs. I couldn't help but reach out and touch them. To my surprise, his ears turned immediately red. I continued to tease him, making him feel warm all over, and I could see a flicker of emotion in his eyes. Eventually, he picked me up with one arm and carried me into the bathroom. At first, he whispered sweet words to me. Over time, our relationship deepened. He gently asked me if we could be together forever and never part again. "Let's not separate again after this time, okay?" I felt a deep pain and started to regret the teasing from before. He softly kissed me, trying to make me relax. It wasn't until I said, "All right," that he stopped. He kissed my lips happily and said, "Good girl, I will always be with you." I couldn't take it anymore and shouted at him, "Didn't you just take a shower? Go out!" My voice trembled a bit, but it sounded more like I was being playful. He leaned in close and softly suggested in my ear that I should wash again, maybe it would be even cleaner. The next day, I dragged my exhausted body to work. My coworkers saw me and gathered around curiously, eager to ask for details. I raised my hand to signal them to hold on, as I didn't want to share anything just yet. I leaned on my desk, hoping to catch a few minutes of sleep before work officially started. But then a colleague suddenly gasped, wide-eyed, and looked around before adjusting the collar of my shirt, which had slid down to the middle of my shoulder. I stole a glance and noticed a conspicuous dark purple mark. Suddenly, I became alert. When I left home today, I hadn't bothered to dress up and simply threw on a loose t-shirt before getting into David Williams's car. I hadn't expected the collar to be so loose that it kept slipping down. I couldn't help but think that it was all David Williams's fault. He really went overboard last night. I looked at my colleague awkwardly and forced a smile. She understood and didn't ask any more questions. Finally, the workday came to an end, only to find that I was meeting not David Williams but Jacob Scott instead. I lightly tapped my head in frustration. David Williams had just messaged me to wait at the company for half an hour because there was an urgent meeting. This made my already difficult workday even worse. As I turned to head back into the company, Jacob Scott caught hold of me. He tightly grasped my arm and said, "Jacob, can you hear me out? I no longer see you as Lily." I was extremely angry. It was too much to bear. "Just leave." He frowned and said, "Jacob, how have you become this way? What have you learned from David Williams? You never used to curse before, but being with him has really influenced you." I usually don't like to swear, but this time I couldn't help it, so I shouted a few curses. He kept trying to explain himself, but everything he said was just belittling David Williams and elevating himself. I couldn't take it anymore, so I bent down, took off my shoes, and threw them hard at his face. He immediately winced in pain and covered his face. He unexpectedly didn't make a scene or question me, he just quietly stared at my shoulder. In the midst of my earlier movement, I hadn't paid attention, and my collar had unintentionally slipped down, revealing a hickey. Jacob Scott looked at me in disbelief and asked, "Are you with him? You got close to him in just 2 weeks. How could you do this? I have begged you for 2 years. So what if I crossed my arms? You're not that kind of person. You won't easily give your heart to someone else. He can't be better than me or make you happier. That's not how it is, Jacob." His expression was filled with pain. "Our relationship is clearly very good, isn't it? To please me," he smiled. "Over these past 3 years, my feelings for him may have existed, but at best, it was just a sense of responsibility one girlfriend has for her boyfriend. I only cared for him a little more than usual. But to make me happy," I shook my head. "He has no idea how tired I am from pretending. I haven't told him the truth yet." He suddenly left in a hurry, and when I turned around, he had disappeared. David Williams walked over to me with a very grim expression. "Does your arm hurt? He was really too rude. I'm going to fire him tomorrow." I shook my head, feeling that this approach wasn't quite appropriate. If the people in the company perceive it as you settling personal scores, it wouldn't reflect well. "Don't worry," he said. "He has never been very proactive at work, and the colleagues have some discontent towards him. Moreover, he missed this urgent meeting, which shows a lack of respect." I smiled and responded, "Then he really should leave." David Williams is someone who acts decisively. By the next day, Jacob Scott had no chance to enter the company at all. In the beginning, he would still come by for a few days, but eventually, he stopped showing up altogether. Since Jacob Scott was dismissed, my life with David Williams has become much calmer. There are no longer any interruptions during my commute. My emotions have gradually stabilized, and my work efficiency has significantly improved. I have consistently achieved the top performance each week. 2 months later, I was finally promoted. David Williams has also been a great help. He always takes on some of the household chores, allowing me to focus on my work. To celebrate my promotion, David Williams and my boss discussed organizing a team-building event this Friday. On that day, my colleagues were all excited. I was thrilled that we didn't have to work on a weekday. I wanted to make the most of this team-building opportunity and see if I could ask Lily from the neighboring company out. "Come on, this is an event specifically organized for us by Mr. Williams from next door. Don't make a fuss about it. We're all benefiting from Chin-Yi's efforts." I smiled and humbly replied, "Oh, not at all. This is the result of everyone's hard work. The venue belongs to you all, so feel free to enjoy it." Before heading to the venue, I specifically put on makeup and wore my favorite burgundy dress. I looked quite radiant, like a rose about to bloom. I linked my arm with David Williams and walked into the venue with him. Everyone was cheerful, chatting and laughing, and it had been a long time since I felt this relaxed. However, there was one thing that made me feel a bit regretful. On my way to the restroom, I ran into Jacob Scott. He looked extremely tired, with unshaved stubble on his chin and bangs almost covering his eyes, giving him a generally disheveled appearance. In that moment, I almost didn't recognize him. I planned to walk past him, but to my surprise, he stepped in front of me, a hint of astonishment in his eyes. "Jacob, why haven't you worn this dress? It looks great on you, it's really beautiful." I didn't respond. In fact, on the first anniversary of being together, I wore that dress. What did he say back then? He said that I shouldn't wear such bright dresses anymore, as he felt they didn't quite suit me. Later, I realized that it wasn't about me not being suited for them, but rather that Lily's style didn't match, because she preferred simple clothes. Jacob, I really miss you. Can we be together again? His voice was choked, filled with regret and pain. I shook my head in refusal. It wasn't right. Why is that? Is it because of David Williams? If it weren't for him, we would definitely still be together. He wanted to reach for my hand, but I dodged him. He still hasn't realized his mistake, nor has he discovered my relationship with David Williams, which is truly sad. I said, did I forget to mention that I've known David Williams for many years before I met you? I'm not someone who takes relationships lightly, nor am I someone you can treat casually. So no matter what you say, I can't be with you anymore. Jacob Scott, I am not someone you can insult at will, nor am I a substitute you can take or leave whenever you want. Tears fell from his eyes as he trembled and took his phone out of his bag. His voice and fingers were trembling as he unlocked his phone and said, Jacob, look, I've learned how to tidy up the house. After I go back, you won't have to do any housework. I've even learned how to cook. I've quit drinking, so there won't be any smell of alcohol in the house anymore. I've dealt with the situation regarding Lily. I won't be looking for substitutes anymore. We were never truly together, and from now on, I will only love you. In these 3 years, you have sacrificed a lot for me, and now it's my turn to repay you. Jacob, I have thought a lot during these past 2 months, and I realize my mistakes. I hope you can forgive me, okay? I'm taking a step back. Jacob Scott, there is no possibility for us anymore, so please stop bothering me. I wish us both well. How do you want me to be okay? Jacob Scott suddenly shouted loudly, filled with tears and regret. I can't forget you. I think about you every single day. How can I get better? I just can't do it. Maybe I raised my voice too much, and my colleagues noticed. They all started to gather around me. Most of these colleagues knew Jacob Scott, and seeing him like this inevitably sparked discussions among them. Although the music was still playing, the voices of the colleagues almost drowned it out. David Williams stood behind me, blocking my way. I gently grabbed his wrist, signaling him not to act too impulsively. Don't worry, I'll be careful. He ruffled my hair. We exchanged glances, and I nodded. Perhaps this gesture hurt Jacob Scott's feelings. What do you think of me, anyway? Are you still showing off your affection in front of me? David Williams, you gave up on Jacob before, which gave me an opportunity. Now you should give her to me. Jacob, listen to me. I have a surprise for you. Shall we go home? We're getting married. Didn't you say before that you wanted to marry the one you love? He held David Williams' hand while taking mine. I said that I have indeed mentioned wanting to marry the person I love, but I never said that the person I love is you. He was taken aback, seemingly unable to believe what I had just said. Jacob, I think I might have heard you wrong. Could you say that again? I urged. Think it over first. I can wait. After that, I fell silent. Because someone called security, Jacob Scott was taken away. David Williams asked everyone to disperse. The team-building event soon became lively again, and before long, this small incident was forgotten by everyone, without affecting the atmosphere. That was the end of the matter, as if Jacob Scott had never been there. A year later, David Williams and I set our wedding date for spring. Spring is the season of renewal, marking the beginning of a new year and the moment we come together. The night before the wedding, David Williams couldn't manage to sleep at all. Each night, he would excitedly hold me close, showering me with kisses. When I finally got a bit annoyed and pushed him away, he still wore a silly grin on his face. Even the day before the wedding, he had already begun planning for things 3 years down the line. I shook my head helplessly. It seems that plans can never keep up with changes. What a fool I am. Suddenly, he lifted me up as if he had discovered a treasure. Did my wife just call me a fool? That's a name reserved for husbands, right? How spoiled. I love you, my wife. Could it be that he's so happy about getting married? However, there was nothing I could do. I could only play along and call him fool for a few days. On the day of the wedding, I received a text message from an unknown number in the dressing room. I immediately guessed who it was. The message said, I heard you're getting married, congratulations. If you ever get a divorce in the future, you can come find me. I'll always be waiting for you. The other party also attached a photo, showing that his home is clean and orderly. The dining table was filled with delicious dishes. David Williams had somehow moved behind me. He took my phone and blocked and deleted a message. I understood his intention. There was no way we could get a divorce. I smiled and reassured him, all right, we won't get divorced. During the vow ceremony of the wedding, 2 butterflies landed on my shoulders. I choked up, feeling as though my parents were present at my wedding. David Williams was even more emotional. He promised to take good care of me so that my parents wouldn't have to worry. When I turned to look again, I saw the 2 butterflies flying together toward the guests, as if love had suddenly become incredibly real at that moment. The spring sunlight bathed the grass, and the flower beds nearby were blooming with vibrant flowers. David Williams placed the flowers he had prepared early on my head. He said he believed that my life and the next would be wonderful, with or without the flowers. However, he hoped that I could be even more fulfilled. We exchanged wedding rings, and since then, we have never taken them off.